Hi, this is Dennis Consorti with Politipeeps. I'm here with Sean Malone from the Foundation of Economic Education, also known as FEE. How are you, Sean?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing well, doing well. Can you tell people about your role at FEE?
Yeah, I am a director of media at FEE, and pretty much anything video, audio, imagery, even some of the website stuff. Anything that's creative media at FEE, I have a hand in, and I also produce a handful of YouTube series like Out of Frame and Common Sense Soapbox. And I imagine we'll probably mostly talk about that kind of stuff.
Exactly right. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Common Sense Soapbox? I watched the UBI episode today. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, Common Sense Soapbox started a couple years ago when I met Seamus Coughlin, who is the writer and animator, or primary writer and animator of that series. And Seamus also has his own channel called Freedom Tunes, which is really popular, actually. I think over 300,000 subscribers now on that channel. And, you know, on that channel, he does a little bit edgier sort of political cartoons. But what we try to do with Common Sense Soapbox is a lighter, little bit like kinder version of, political cartoon, political animation that gets into, economics, political theory. And we try to talk about current events there a little bit more than I do on some of my other things. So we'll pull things, speaking of pulling things from the headlines, we'll do a little bit of that on that series. The UBI episode, though, is a little bit of a thorn in my side because I realized kind of after we put it out that I feel, and I think some of my commenters felt, it was part two of a multi-part series that we didn't do part one on, which I feel a little bad about. And I'll tell you the behind the scenes of that a little bit if you want. But yeah, I'm glad you saw it at least and enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'd love to get into more depth about Common Sense Soapbox and some of your other work. Perhaps we can have an extended interview on those a bit later.
Sure.
But for right now, I do want to mention, besides the animated stuff, you've also done some documentaries like No Man's Land and Locked Out, which I also enjoyed. Can you tell us just a little bit about the premise of each of those?
Yeah, and to be fair, those are some of my older pieces, but and I'm really proud of both of those. No Man's Land is the story of a Jamaican immigrant who came to New York City and built a commuter van service in Queens, in sort of the outer areas of Queens, Flushing and Kew Gardens and that kind of area where city buses, taxis, that kind of stuff were pretty rare. And he imported this dollar van idea from the Caribbean, which is pretty normal there, where it's basically a very cheap ride, hop on, hop off, small sort of 15 passenger vans, small minibuses, things like that, still kind of run routes as if they are buses, but they're private. And they're affordable, they're safe, they're great. A lot of times Hector Ricketts, who that story is about, will actually drop you off at your door if it's cold or if it's like a bad time of night or something like that. And it was really serving a need in New York City, but it was also illegal. And it still to this day remains sort of borderline in a lot of cases. They have a few areas that they're allowed to legally pick up and drop off, not that many. And Hector's still fighting some of that battle. But that documentary was about their struggle for, sort of normalization and legalization of that business. And then Locked Out is about Melanie Armstrong, who's still a dear friend of mine and became the first licensed and sort of state-approved African hair braider in Mississippi, and then who proceeded to challenge the laws to make it open for just about anybody who wants to braid hair as a profession without getting an expensive cosmetology license. When she started, cosmetology programs were, I think, somewhere in the realm of like $20,000. She ended up convincing them to allow her to get a wigologist license, which is a thing that doesn't really exist anymore and which still cost her $10,000. And by the way, neither of those programs teaches hair braiding, which is the one thing that she actually does for a living. So a lot of these things, and I think both are themed around this idea of occupational licensing and sort of protectionist regulations designed to keep people out of a given market. Hector's big battle was against the Taxi and Limousine Commission and against the Municipal Bus Drivers Union. And, Melanie's primary battle was against the established cosmetology boards, which are state-chartered boards of people who run cosmetology schools and cosmetology businesses. And so it's no surprise that the taxis and the buses don't want competition. It's no surprise that the cosmetology board wanted to force people to go through the schools that they run to be allowed to run their businesses, right? And we see this kind of protectionism and this kind of and regulation being used in this way quite a lot in society, and it's something that I care a lot about and something I've made a number of documentaries about at this point.
Yeah, it seems like in their cases, the government just got in the way of people who wanted to just earn a living.
Yeah.
And I'd love to explore that, possibly with the three of you, if we can swing it at some point in the future.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds great. Now, some people would say that the primary purpose of government is to protect us. And because of this, there are regulations that are designed to protect the environment from polluters and to protect people from dangerous products or companies that would otherwise take advantage of them.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, how would you change the way in which government regulations are applied?
Well, first I want to challenge that premise for people a little bit, because I've heard that for years. We've all heard that, a million times, because that is the way that regulations are sort of packaged is we need this because otherwise people would be unsafe, they get hurt, greedy business people would take advantage of them and all that kind of stuff. What I found, though, especially the more I dug into occupational licensing regulations, is that most of the time regulations like that are designed to protect incumbent business operators. They're designed to limit the market so that competition doesn't take a bite out of their market share, basically. And we see that quite a lot. Like there's, and some of the things, especially once you really start looking at what the arguments are, some of the arguments against hair braiding being, fundamentally unlicensed in Mississippi were that without fully licensed hair braiders, people would get AIDS because, reasons which literally don't exist. Like there's no reason why you would get AIDS from braiding hair. There's no chemicals involved. There's no piercing of anything. There's nothing that could do that. And then to make matters worse, when challenged by the Institute for Justice, which is the public interest law firm that took Melanie's case, well, what do you guys do as cosmetology schools to train people to deal with AIDS? The answer is nothing, right? They don't train people to deal with AIDS. They just used the most extreme argument they possibly could. Same thing with Hector. I mean, they were, the arguments against Hector's business was like, well, what if somebody gets murdered on one of your vans? And you go, well, what if somebody gets murdered on your city bus? Like, what if a cab driver drives out somewhere? These are outlier, ridiculous cases that no amount of these kinds of regulations actually solve. But they're the kinds of things that come up when you look at how these regulations are put into place. So again, I want to challenge anybody who thinks that regulations in general are meant just for protection. I would like to look a little deeper into some of these things, because some are and quite a lot are not. And I think when we get into the answer of the question, like how would I change the way that they're applied, I think the first thing is to have a really serious review process on whether or not a regulation is sort of outcomes based or if it is specific in the sense of like for example, I want to sort of clarify this, because if you have a regulation that says nobody in the entire country is allowed to rob somebody during the course of doing business. Nobody is allowed to commit fraud, take money that's not theirs, whatever. and you make that a regulatory statute that carries with it specific penalties, that's something that is completely even across the board. It is outcomes based. It doesn't matter what business you run. You're not allowed to cheat, right? You're not allowed to commit fraud. Okay, that's the kind of regulation that I can go, okay, fine, right? You're not allowed to pollute other people's land with, you know, lead, for example, right? Got it, cool. But when you start saying you must use this type of light bulb, you must go through this process to be allowed to do business in this sphere, you must be trained by this school over here, you got to start looking at that and asking where and why those regulations are coming into place. And we don't have very good review process with that. We also don't have very good processes for reviewing regulations over time. So there's very little in the way of regulations being re-evaluated and repealed naturally. And that gets to another thing that I would probably do, although I know that there are arguments against it, is actually set sunset clauses on pretty much every regulation that exists. Like naturally, this regulation will go for 5 years. After 5 years, we have to reevaluate using this process, and otherwise it's gone and automatically gone. Not, you know, not we will repeal it, but it's just automatically just goes away. I think there are an awful lot of things out there that people care about in the short term because it becomes a big media thing, or it becomes a thing that, you know, this special interest group really cares about, that if we really look at it and we really reevaluate it, we learn that, well, the only reason it exists is because they and government were working together to, you know, to impose this restriction on somebody, and we find that it doesn't do what we think it's going to do. I mean, I think red light cameras is a good example of this, right? Like red light cameras are supposed to be, you know, protecting us and stopping us from running red lights, and what we find is that it's actually a lot of times makes running red lights worse, but it generates a lot of revenue for police departments, so we keep doing it, right? But that's not a good reason to regulate something. You know, the only good reason I can really think of is legitimately to protect somebody's life, liberty, or property. You know, and if it's not doing that, I think we need to get real serious about culling some of those things.
Makes sense. And how do people find you online?
You can find me at fee.org, fee.org/shows. It's probably my favorite place. And then YouTube, youtube.com/beonline, instagram.com/beonline. And if you're interested in just checking me out separately to all of that, it is citizena.tv.
All right, this is Dennis Consorti with PolitiPeeps. Make sure that you like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications.